Angiography interventional procedures is potentially one of the greatest sources of exposure to personnel in radiology, since it requires the presence of a considerable number of people to work closely to the patient for a long period of time. Now, the C-arm fluoroscope can be manipulated in almost any position, and it can remain energized for the length of time required for the particular procedure. Examples of these lengthy exams include things like when an orthosurgeon is performing an open reduction of a fractured hip in the operating room, or a vascular surgeon is performing an interventional procedure, maybe he's looking for a aortic aneurysm. Now, when the radiographer and other medical personnel participate in these lengthy procedures that require the tube to be energized for long periods of time, they are subject to an increased radiation exposure. For this reason, personnel must wear a lead apron instead of crowding behind a portable lead shield. The apron should be at least 0.5 millimeters lead equivalent to ensure adequate protection. Scheduling personnel to rotate through or spend less time in these higher radiation areas can decrease their exposure, and scheduling uses the cardinal principle of time as a means of additional radiation protection. Reduce the time, reduce the exposure. Personnel working in these areas must be aware of the radiation hazards involved and make every effort to adhere to the requirements and recommendations set out by their facility or department, or they could look up guidelines, basic safety guidelines, or guidelines recommended by Safety Code 35. Either way, they should be aware of the risks and how to reduce them. They should make full use of protective devices. The patient is always the largest source of scatter, so they should try to avoid this scatter and operate the equipment with the tube under the patient. If the tube is horizontal, they should stand on the side of the image receptor. All personnel should not only be wearing protective clothing, but also their personal dosimeters, and if they have two of them, they should be wearing one underneath the apron and one above the apron at the collar level. If protective glasses are available, they must be worn. All personnel who are not required to be immediately adjacent to the patient during the procedure should be standing back as far as possible, while still being able to effectively carry out their duties, and if at all possible, should be standing behind the protective shield. The technologist, radiographer, or radiologist should avail of whatever is in the room at the time to protect themselves. They could possibly be Bucky slot covers or ceiling suspended lead acrylic screens that can be used as well. And always remember that the patient is the largest source of scatter. And to avoid this scatter, operate the equipment with a tube under the patient. Limit the time, increase your distance, and shield yourself. This radiation safety checklist for personnel comes from the Safety Code 35 of Canada. Now, it draws attention to the practices that should be followed when working in these high-risk areas. Radiation safety survey reports are also generated to draw attention to any practices which could be detrimental to the patient or to the personnel working in the facility. Now, recommendations of improved or safer techniques are then made in cases where the potential risk is increased to the staff or the personnel. So when you are working in an X-ray department, you'll be wearing a TLD to monitor your exposure or your dose to your entire body. The radiation dosimetry report provides a record of that dose, that being the dose information which was recorded over the time period in which the TLD badge was worn. So at CNAQ, the TLD badge is read every 3 months and analyzed every 3 months. The report then provides a deep dose equivalent, a lens dose equivalent, and a shallow dose equivalent. And this is for each instructor and student wearing a monitoring device. The dose report will be maintained for the lifetime of the facility. Now, why is this important? It's important because having a dosimetry service program provides data that can be used to identify situations of overexposure, and in that way we can take corrective action to minimize radiation exposure in the future. It also helps improve peace of mind knowing that the workplace is a safe environment to be. Now, based on the work environment, and by that I mean, are you working in radiotherapy, nuclear medicine, the X-ray field, based on the type of work you're doing, dosimetry or dosimeters can be read at different times. It could be read daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and that will all depend on the type of radiation work you do. Also, in some institutions, as mentioned before, after pregnancy has been declared, the institution may agree to monitor the worker on a monthly basis. And when the report does come back, they're expecting to see no more than 0.5 millisievert equivalent dose to the surface of the abdomen. So what you see in this slide is a screenshot of CNAQ's personal dose monitoring report. Now I've cropped off a certain section of it that includes the names and the CATA IDs. So that will be included on every dose monitoring report. So typically what you would see on this report is a name, a CATA ID, the date the TLD was issued, analyzed, the date the TLD was returned, and as you can see here, you have 3 columns with different values, each of which represent a different exposure. DE is the external whole body equivalent dose at a tissue depth of about 10 millimeters. DS is the external skin equivalent dose at a tissue depth of 0.07 millimeters, and DX is the external equivalent dose to the extremities, such as the hands and the feet. All reasonable efforts should be made to keep the doses below the maximum yearly limit, which for students are set at 1 millisievert cumulative effective dose a year. Now, I can honestly say, as the person reviewing these reports, that these limits has never been exceeded. If the limits are exceeded, a formal investigation into the potential reason will be conducted, as this is required by the Radiation Protection Authority in the country. An investigation will be initiated as soon as possible following the discovery of the event, and a written report will be prepared concerning the cause. Good documentation has to be kept because this, in essence, will help put corrective action in place and instructions or recommendations to avoid such occurrences in the future. So how are instructors and students protected at CNAQ? Well, there are radiation warning signs on doors to indicate that it's a controlled area, and all students' work is supervised to prevent any accidental exposure to students. Also, there are primary and secondary barriers in all the rooms. There's a control booth, an X-ray panel with a short exposure cord that prevents the occurrence of a possible accidental exposure to a student or a staff member. Indicator lights are present, which are radiation warning lights above the X-ray room door, and this lights up to tell you that an exposure is taking place, and in that way you would not go into the X-ray room and accidentally expose yourself. Lead shielding is available. All of the lead shields at the college are currently 0.5 millimeter lead equivalency. Personal dosimeters are provided. You get a TLD badge, which is read and analyzed every 3 months. Remember, it is vitally important that you return that badge on time so you can get an accurate reading of stored information on that TLD badge. A radiation safety manual does exist at the college. Policies and procedures are put in place, such as time, distance, and shielding. The operator must keep exposures ALARA, reduce the time of the exposure as much as possible, and not stand in the direct beam. If you are performing any portable or C-arm work, if you're practicing on phantoms, you should be keeping a distance of at least 3 meters from the X-ray tube, from the mobile X-ray machine. In addition, to ensure safety, regular preventative maintenance is performed on all of our equipment. So on this note, we'll end the module on minimizing dose to personnel. I have included a few review and practice questions at the end of this unit. Please do take the time to complete them on your own, because you never know, they might be on your final exam. These are the references that I used for this learning module. As you can see here, information was used not only from the textbook, but the ICRP guidelines as well as the IAEA guidelines. So what are the takeaway messages for today? You've learned so many things, and some of them you may have already known. But what I want you to take home today is always to remember ALARA. Keep those doses as low as is reasonably achievable, because it also reduces scatter and dose to yourself. Try to avoid repeating. If the X-ray image is not perfect but shows you what you need to see, don't repeat the image. Patient collimation is essential because it reduces the source of scatter. The larger the X-ray field, the more scatter you're going to generate. So your main source of radiation to yourself is from that scatter. So try and keep it to a minimum and collimate as much as possible. Use filtration because this filters out the low energy X-rays that are of no use to the patient and neither to yourself. Wear personal protective equipment. Wear the lead apron and the thyroid collar and the lead glasses when you're working in the fluoroscopy or interventional or operating room. And try and manipulate those exposure factors when you are in the X-ray room to optimize not only your image, but also to optimize the exposure so that you're not getting any excess scatter radiation and increasing your dose. Okay, so that's it for this unit, and we'll be moving on to the next one soon.